First grade would like to be reading Mr. Tanen's Tie by Maria Coca-Leffler. Mr. Tanen is the principal of Lyndhurst Elementary School. All the children love him, and they also love his ties. Every morning, as the children enter the school, they check out Mr. Tanen's tie. It's a good way to start the day. Mr. Tanen has quite a tie collection. Funny ties, crazy ties, holiday ties, ties that play music, and even ties that light up. He also has a big collection of tourist ties. Anytime students go on a trip, they bring home a tie from Mr. Tanen. His office closet bulges with ties. He changes his ties several times a day, depending on his mood, the weather, or what's for lunch in the cafeteria. On Frankfurt Friday, he always puts on his hot dog tie. No one will know if I get mustard on it, he says. If the weather suddenly changes, so does his tie. If he is wearing his umbrella tie, you know that it's raining even before you look outside. And for official duties, he always wears his red, white, and blue tie with yellow stars. One day, Mr. Tanen had an important meeting with Mr. Apple at the school department. Everyone in town called Mr. Apple Mr. Crabapple because he was always grouchy and never smiled. Of course, Mr. Tanen wore the appropriate tie. Mr. Tanen, what Mr. Apple began, "You are a fine principal, but there is one thing that concerns me." "What's that, Mr. Apple?" asked Mr. Tanen. "Education is serious business, said Mr. Apple.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, agreed Mr. Tanen. "You are a role model for your students," said Mr. Apple. Mr. Tanen nodded. "Therefore, you should look proper at all times." Mr. Apple pointed to Mr. Tanen's tie. "And that is not proper." He handed Mr. Tanen a plain blue tie. "This is. From now on, Mr. Tanen, keep your silly ties in your closet. You are to wear only blue ties." Mr. Tanen was shocked. "No sports ties with soccer balls? No tourist ties with palm trees and pink flamingos? No, Mr. Tanen. No lights up tree ties and at Christmas? No, Mr. Tanen. Blue ties, just blue." The next day, Mr. Tanen greeted the children as usual, but something was not right. "Mr. Tanen, your tie, it's just plain blue," said Alex. Mr. Tanen felt just plain blue. He sighed. "Sorry, kids. It's proper blue from now on. Strict orders from Mr. Apple." "Boring," said Carlo.
How are we going to know the weather? Asked Lila. Or what we're having for lunch, said Kaylee. Mr. Tanen shrugged sadly. Mr. Tanen didn't feel like talking to anyone all morning. At lunch, he wished he had on his hot dog tie. When the second grade celebrated Kristen's birthday, he couldn't wear his special tie that played Happy Birthday to You. Alex was worried. Mr. Tannen is not the same, he thought. Early Monday morning, the school secretary phoned Mr. Apple. Sir, Mr. Tannen just called in sick. He will be out all week with the blues. You will have to come to the Lyndhurst school to fill in as principal. The children were surprised to see Mr. Apple greet them at the door. I will be your principal for the week, he snapped. Let's have a straight line, no talking, no running. I miss Mr. Tannen already, whispered Alex.
That afternoon, Mr. Apple even made recess rules. No playing on the wet grass, he yelled. You'll track mud in the school. Recess was no fun. The kids were happy when the bell rang. As they were filing in, they saw Mr. Apple climbing a tree. What's he doing up there, spying on us? Asked Kylie. I can't believe it. He's bird watching, said Olivia. He actually looks happy, said Carlo. That gave Alex an idea.
On Tuesday, Alex gave Mr. Apple a tie with birds on it. Thank you, Alex, but that's not quite my style. When he was alone, Mr. Apple stared at the tie. Cardinals are my favorite bird, he thought. He held the tie up to his plain gray suit. He couldn't help but to try it on. After school, Mr. Apple wore his new tie to the grocery store. Hello, Mr. Apple, said the cashier, Miss Sweet. Good day, mumbled Mr. Apple. Lovely tie, complimented Miss Sweet. You must like birds. I'm crazy about cats. Mr. Apple smiled a little. On Wednesday, Mr. Apple picked up his mail. Then he sat at Mr. Tanen's desk to work. But today, he couldn't concentrate. He opened Mr. Tanen's closet and searched through the ties. He found just what he was looking for. In the afternoon, he went to the grocery store again. He got in Mrs. Sweet's checkout line. Mr. Apple. Now that's a charming tie. Mr. Apple and Miss Sweet chatted for a long time. On Thursday after school, Mr. Apple thumbed through Mr. Tanen's ties again. This time he heard music. It was coming from a tie. Mr. Apple headed to the grocery store. When he got to the register, he pressed the tie. It played, Let Me Call You Sweetheart. Mr. Apple, I never knew you would be so delightful, said Miss Sweet. Mr. Apple handed Miss Sweet a rose. Will you have dinner with me tonight? I would love to, Mr. Apple. On Friday morning, Mr. Apple greeted the children wearing a tie with red hearts. "Isn't that Mr. Tannen's Valentine tie?" asked Alex. Mr. Apple grinned. "Well, I don't think he'd mind if I borrow it. Do you?" "He won't mind!" shouted the kids. On Monday, Mr. Tanen came back to school. Mr. Apple was waiting at the door. "That tie, Mr. Tanen," grumbled Mr. Apple. "Sorry, sir. Got a stain on it. Mustard," apologized Mr. Tanen. "Well, it's a good thing I bought you another one," said Mr. Apple. He handed Mr. Tanen a box. Mr. Tanen sighed. He opened the lid.
A big smile spread across his face. "It's just your kind of blue," said Mr. Apple. Then Mr. Apple gave him a shopping bag filled with letters. "The kids have been writing me letters all week. They want their principal back, and so do I." "Thank you, Mr. Apple." "One other thing," Mr. Apple said shyly. "Can you lend me this wedding bell tie? I have an important date tonight."